My name is Vanessa, and this is the story of how my ambition and desires led me down a path of betrayal and unexpected consequences. It all began 3 years ago when I met Greg at a high society party in New York City. He was everything a woman could desire: attractive, successful, and most importantly, immensely wealthy. From the moment our eyes met, I knew I had to make him mine. Not for love, but for what he represented: financial, security, and an enviable social status. Greg fell head over heels for me, almost immediately. My beauty and my cunning ability to manipulate situations in my favor made the job easy. Within months, we were officially dating, and I made sure everyone in his social circle adored me. I became the perfect girlfriend, always attentive, always willing to please him in everything. But there was a problem with a name: Luke, Greg's cousin. From the first time I saw him, I felt an irresistible attraction. He was like Greg, but younger, more passionate, more dangerous. And I, being who I am, couldn't resist tasting the forbidden fruit. Our affair began innocently, or at least that's what we told ourselves. A knowing glance here, an accidental brush there. Until one night, at one of the many family parties, we snuck into the garden and kissed with a passion I had never experienced before. From that moment on, my life became a constant juggling act. On one hand, I maintained my facade of a devoted girlfriend with Greg, accepting his marriage proposal with false excitement and planning a wedding fit for royalty. On the other, I secretly met with Luke, giving in to an unbridled passion that made me feel more alive than ever. My plan was simple: marry Greg, wait long enough for it not to seem suspicious, and then divorce him, taking half of his fortune. With that money, Luke and I could escape and live the life I had always dreamed of. It was perfect, or so I thought. What I didn't anticipate was that my feelings for Luke would start to grow beyond simple physical desire. I found myself thinking about him constantly, longing for his presence, his laughter, his way of looking at me as if I were the only woman in the world. It was a terrifying and exciting feeling at the same time. As the wedding day approached, my nerves were on edge. Was I doing the right thing? Was it worth risking everything for money? Or should I follow my heart and escape with Luke before it was too late? The day finally arrived. I was in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids who wouldn't stop praising how beautiful I looked in my designer dress. But all I could think about was Luke, his lips, his hands roaming my body. As if I had summoned him with my thoughts, the door opened, and there he was, so handsome in his best man suit that it took my breath away. Our eyes met, and at that moment, I knew I couldn't marry Greg. Not without having one last moment with Luke. With a flimsy excuse, I snuck into the bathroom and signaled Luke to follow me. As soon as he closed the door behind him, I threw myself into his arms, kissing him desperately. "I can't do it, Luke," I whispered between kisses. "I can't marry Greg. I love you." Luke looked at me with a mixture of surprise and joy. "I love you too, Vanessa. Let's run away together, right now." And so, in the bathroom of the bridal suite, minutes before my wedding, we gave in to passion one more time. Our hands roamed our bodies urgently, desperate to feel every inch of each other. We were so lost in our world that we didn't hear the door open. The muffled scream of one of the bridesmaids brutally brought us back to reality. There we were, half naked, embracing, with the evidence of our betrayal etched on our flushed faces. What followed was total chaos. The bridesmaid, in her shock, had taken photos with her phone before we could react. Within minutes, the images had spread among the guests like wildfire. Greg burst in, furious, his eyes full of pain and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "My fiancé and my own cousin." I tried to explain myself, to tell him I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to hurt him. But how do you explain something like that? How do you tell the man you were about to marry that you actually only wanted him for his money, and that you've fallen in love with his cousin? My story isn't over yet. please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the story. In the midst of the chaos, Luke tried to defend our love, but that only made things worse. Greg, blinded by anger and pain, punched him, leaving him sprawled on the floor. The entire family was in shock, divided between disbelief and fury. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as my elaborate plan crumbled around me. Not only had I lost the opportunity to get my hands on Greg's fortune, but I had also destroyed a family in the process. The following days were hell. My name was in all the gossip magazines, my reputation in tatters. Greg, in an act of revenge, made sure that no door in high society would ever open for me again. Luke, for his part, was disinherited and expelled from the family. We were left with nothing, just each other, and a love born of betrayal. We decided to move to another city, far from the scandal, to try to rebuild our lives together. It wasn't easy. The weight of what we had done constantly haunted us. At first, our love seemed strong enough to overcome any obstacle. We supported each other, swearing that everything would be worth it as long as we were together. But little by little, the reality of our situation began to erode. That illusion. Luke, accustomed to a life of luxury, became increasingly frustrated with our financial limitations. I, for my part, couldn't help but long for the life I had been so close to having. Arguments became more frequent, reconciliations less sincere. Years passed, and although we were still together, something had changed. The fire of passion that once consumed us had turned into lukewarm embers of habit. I found myself looking at other men, wondering how my life would be if I had made different decisions. It was then that I met Alex. He was a successful businessman, not as rich as Greg, but wealthy enough to pique my interest. We started as friends, but soon I found myself making up excuses to see him more often. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time I was more careful, more calculating. I wouldn't make the same mistakes of the past. Luke suspected nothing, too, busy with his own work and frustrations to notice the subtle changes in my behavior. My encounters with Alex became more frequent and more intimate. He made me feel desired, important. Things I hadn't felt with Luke in a long time. I convinced myself that I deserved this happiness, that after everything I had been through, the universe owed me something good. But fate, that capricious player, had other plans for me. One night, while dining with Alex at an exclusive restaurant, I saw someone who made my blood run cold. Greg. He was sitting a few tables away, accompanied by a beautiful woman who wore an engagement ring. Our eyes met for an instant, and I saw in his eyes a flash of recognition, followed by something I couldn't decipher. Contempt? Pity? Or perhaps a mixture of both. That night, as I returned home to Luke, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Seeing Greg had reminded me of everything I had lost, everything I had sacrificed. And now, here I was, about to make the same mistake again. I decided it was time to be honest, at least with myself. I didn't love Luke, probably never really had. And I certainly didn't love Alex. What I loved was the idea of love, the thrill of conquest, the adrenaline of deception. That night, while Luke slept, I quietly packed my things. I left a note explaining that I was leaving, that I needed to find myself, that I was sorry for all the pain I had caused. It was a pathetic excuse, I knew, but it was the best I could offer. At dawn, I found myself at the bus station with a ticket to an unknown city. As the bus pulled away, I looked out the window at the streets that had been my home for the past few years. I felt a mixture of relief and fear of the unknown. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for certain. It was time to stop looking for happiness in others and start looking for it in myself. I had made mistakes. I had hurt people who didn't deserve it, but I still had the opportunity to be better, to redeem myself. As the landscape changed outside the window, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to dream of a new beginning. A beginning where I could be honest, where I could love without betraying, where I could be the person I always knew I could be. And so, with my heart full of hope and remorse in equal parts, I embarked on the most important journey of my life, the journey towards myself. Months after my departure, I found myself in a small coastal town in California, working as a waitress in a local cafe. Life was simple, very different from what I was used to, but for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. It was there, amidst the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of waves breaking on the nearby beach, where I began to truly reflect on my past actions. Every face I had hurt, every heart I had broken, every lie I had told, it all weighed on my conscience. I decided it was time to make peace with my past. I couldn't change what I had done, but I could learn from it and make sure I didn't repeat the same mistakes. I started writing letters I would never send, but which helped me process my emotions and ask for forgiveness, even if it was only to myself. One afternoon, while cleaning tables after closing, a lingering customer caught my attention. He was an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile. He introduced himself as George, a local writer who came to the cafe every afternoon to work on his novel. Over time, George became a friend, someone I could talk to without fear of being judged. I told him my story, my whole story, without omitting a single embarrassing detail. To my surprise, instead of condemning me, he listened with understanding and offered me a perspective I had never considered. "We all make mistakes, Vanessa," he told me one day. "What's important is not what we did in the past, but what we do with the lessons we learned." His words resonated with me in a way no advice had before I realized I had spent so much time running from my past that I hadn't allowed myself to grow from it. Inspired by George, I began to write my own story, not as a way to justify my actions, but as an exercise in brutal honesty with myself. Every word I wrote was like a weight lifting from my shoulders. As I progressed in my narrative, I realized there was a pattern in my behavior. I had always sought validation and security in others instead of finding it in myself. I had used love and seduction as tools to get what I thought I needed, without realizing that what I really needed was to learn to love myself. One day, while walking on the beach at sunset, I had an epiphany. I didn't need a rich man, or a passionate lover, or even an understanding friend to be happy. What I needed was to forgive myself and give myself the chance to be the person I had always wanted to be. That night, I finished my manuscript. It was raw, honest, and in many ways, painful to read. But it was my truth, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely authentic. With George's support, I decided to publish my story as a novel. I changed the names and some details to protect the privacy of the people involved, but the essence of my journey remained intact. To my surprise, the book was a success. Many people identified with my struggle, with my mistakes, with my search for redemption. I received letters from readers thanking me for my honesty, telling me how my story had helped them face their own demons. It was during a book signing when I saw him. Greg was there, in line, with a copy of my book in his hands. My heart stopped for a moment, and I felt all the air leave my lungs. When it was his turn, we looked into each other's eyes for what seemed like an eternity. I saw in his gaze a mixture of emotions that I couldn't fully decipher. Finally, he broke the silence. "I read your book," he said simply, his voice softer than I remembered. It was revealing. I didn't know what to say. How do you apologize to someone you've hurt so deeply? Words seemed inadequate, insufficient. "Greg," I began, but he raised a hand to stop me. "I didn't come looking for an apology, Vanessa," he said. "I came because I wanted you to know that I forgive you." His words hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless. Of all the reactions I had imagined, this was the one I least expected. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. Greg smiled slightly, a smile tinged with sadness and wisdom. "Because carrying resentment was only hurting me, and because your book made me realize that we are all more than our mistakes." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I held them back. This wasn't the moment for my emotional catharsis. This was Greg's moment, his incredible act of kindness. "Thank you," I said simply, because there was nothing else I could say. Greg nodded, handed me the book to sign, and then left, leaving me with a sense of closure that I didn't know I so desperately needed. That night, back in my small apartment above the cafe, I reflected on the encounter with Greg. His forgiveness was a gift I didn't deserve, but one I accepted with gratitude. It made me realize that if he could forgive me, maybe it was time for me to forgive myself completely. The following months were a whirlwind of interviews, more book signings, and letters from readers. My story had struck a nerve in society, opening up conversations about love, betrayal, and redemption. I found myself in a position I never would have imagined, as a voice of warning and hope for others who might be tempted to take the same destructive path I had taken. It was during this period that I received a letter that would change my life once again. It was from Luke. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Vanessa, I've read your book. I can't say it was easy, reliving everything we went through together, seeing our story through your eyes. But I want you to know that I understand. I understand why you did what you did, why we did what we did to each other. I'm not writing to recriminate you or to seek you out. I'm writing because your book made me realize that I too need to close this chapter of my life. I need to forgive you and forgive myself. I hope you found the peace you were looking for. I'm on that path too. Take care, Luke." The tears I had held back for so long finally spilled. Luke's letter was the last link in the chain of my redemption. With Greg and Luke having found the strength to forgive, I felt I could finally breathe freely. That night, sitting on the beach watching the sunset, I made a decision. It was time to use my experience, my story, to help others. I decided to found a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people trapped in toxic relationships and destructive behavior patterns. The years passed, and my life took a direction I never would have imagined. My organization grew, helping hundreds of people find their way to healthier relationships and more authentic lives. I wrote more books, gave talks, and, little by little, the calculating and manipulative woman I once was became a distant memory. One day, while walking on the beach that had become my refuge, I ran into George. He was older, but his eyes still had the same spark of wisdom. "How are you, Vanessa?" he asked with a smile. "I'm at peace," I replied, and for the first time in my life, I really felt it. George nodded, as if he had always known I would reach this point. "And what's next?" he asked. I looked towards the horizon, where the sun was sinking into the sea, painting the sky in golden and pink hues. "Keep living," I said, simply, "keep learning, keep growing." George smiled, and together we stayed watching the sunset, silent witnesses to the end of one day and the beginning of another. As the last ray of sunlight disappeared on the horizon, I reflected on my journey. I had started as a woman driven by ambition and desire, willing to betray and manipulate to get what I wanted. I had hurt people who loved me, destroyed relationships, and had been on the verge of losing myself in the process. But somehow, through pain, shame, and remorse, I had found a path to redemption. I wasn't perfect. I never would be. But I had learned to accept my imperfections, to learn from my mistakes, and to use my experience to help others. My story was a testament that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become a better version of oneself. And as I walked back to my house, with the sea breeze caressing my face, I felt a deep gratitude for this second chance that life had given me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be days when memories of my past would try to drag me back to old habits, but now I had the tools to face those moments, to choose a different path. And so, with my heart full of hope and determination, I prepared for the next chapter of my life. A chapter full of possibilities, growth, and most importantly, authentic love. Not the passionate and destructive love I once pursued, but a deeper and truer love. Love for myself and for the life I had chosen to live. As I closed the door of my house behind me, I smiled. My story of betrayal and redemption had come to an end, but my journey was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I was excited to see what the future held, ready to face it with honesty, integrity, and compassion. And so, with the sound of the waves as background music, I prepared for sleep, grateful for every experience that had led me to this moment, and hopeful for all the moments yet to come.